Hello again. Thanks for joining me. Today, we're talking about Viking weapons. One of my favorite subjects to talk about, one of my favorite things to research, and incidentally, collect. I have all kinds of fun things due to my hobby of Viking Age reenactment. I wanted to talk about a little bit of the origins of Viking Age weapons, show some examples of Viking Age weapons themselves, and discuss what some of these weapons evolved into in later history in the same regions. Most of this stuff is going to be a fairly universal weapon set, so to speak, for just about anyone that was Scandinavian, Frankish, or English. There was a lot of cultural intermixing, just lots of interactions with each other, even genetics that were shared due to earlier migrations. So one of the first things that we see all throughout Northern Europe through into the medieval age is the shield. Now, round shields necessarily never fully went away, but the round shield predates the Viking Age and it goes on past it. They were relatively light and thin when we're discussing Viking shields, wrapped in leather on the faces, sometimes having colors and patterns to signify clans and things like that. Boss grip, no arm supports. Very specific for these shields. They weren't arm strapped. A lot of the strap shields that were the round style of the earlier ages had actually a strap in the front and a strap for your forearm in the middle. And they didn't contain this steel boss. When we see these steel bosses, in a sense, evolve into what we might know as the buckler even. Just a small boss grip, and a small shield like that's pretty effective. They have found some pretty small Viking shields and some fairly large Viking shields. And when I refer to a Viking shield, I'm really describing a Viking Age shield. A round shield would have been used by the Franks as well as the English. So really lightweight, and they were plank construction. So nowadays most of us use plywood, and our reenactment shields tend to be a lot heavier. The examples that we have the edges actually somewhat tapering, so they were reducing weight quite a bit with these shields. And when we have this boss grip, works very well in a shield wall. So if your arm was strapped in, yes, in a shield wall it would work pretty well. But your extension is somewhat compromised. Just your ability to make changes in your position, not quite as easy. In a shield wall, it would be probably pretty advantageous to brace your shield with your weapon hand as well, if you could. Also lends to some of the theory where we might have a spear overhand with pressure on the shield, at least creating a point of threat in that shield wall. So the arm strap would work fairly well in some situations, but we don't have examples of them. So it's kind of debatable if they were used or not. But when we talk evolutions, these shields evolved into what we know as the kite shield. Another iconic thing is the Viking axe. The bearded axe is a tool. If you look at anyone who does real traditional ancient carpentry, where it's axe hewing, they have a lot of different types of bearded axes. So to get into the axe, a lot of axes were carried on a Viking campaign. They were a camp tool, they were a fighting weapon, but they also were not a specialized fighting weapon. Having things that are multi-purpose is pretty advantageous if you're only going to bring what you can with you. So specialized axes, which we will get into, came a little bit later on. So this is a very functional tool in camp when I use this. If you work hard enough, you could get a tree down. The beard itself lends to the axe not getting stuck in stuff as easily. It's a little easier to remove. And it's also quite a formidable tool in combat for hooking limbs, weapons, shields. Bearded axe is an awesome thing. And we only can guess how long the hafts were on these. But with a shield, something like this is pretty awesome. It's a pretty awesome weapon. wouldn't actually function all that bad as a sidearm. So if you're going to carry a shield and you're going to carry an axe, you're going to have the next and most important thing, the spear. So when it gets into terminology of what spears are, spear, lance, pike, it's kind of in a lot of ways based off of their length. I know that's a little bit of a contentious statement, but it is to a degree. So a regular foot soldier spear is going to be about 7 to 9 feet. Could even be 10 feet. Someone who's a mounted spearman, which we don't have a lot of in the Viking Age. There wasn't a lot of mounted combat. We see that, of course, with the Normans. But anyways, on a horse, on a big horse, creating that distance, you're going to need something even longer. And those are going to be something like 10 to 15 feet. And when we look into what pikes are, of course, a later spear development, those can be up to 15 to 20 feet. It's really crazy. They do have a complete Viking spear that was found. It ranged from about 1.25 inches all the way to the end. It was 8 feet long, so 1.25 inches in diameter, tapered all the way down to 3/4 of an inch for the socket. And it had a 13-inch long head. So this is a 12-inch long head. So this is somewhat of a common spearhead into the medieval age. Something like this. A lot of them were even Celtic styled, where they were round, kind of leaf shape. We do have hewing spears, which have wings. They're also known as boar spears. The wings themselves, there's lots of theories for how they were used, but using them ourselves, we see some of the benefits of them. When it comes to boar spears, it's meant to not have the boar over-penetrate on your spear. But when we have these types of wings, it can add a little bit of a hooking effect, making it a little bit more of a weapon you can parry with. And a hewing spear tends to be thicker shaft and sometimes pretty long. That would lend the idea to that it could have been more of a two-handed weapon. But if you really could manage it and you were in the battle line, you had a spear and a shield, you had a really big hewing spear, strong enough guy, I'm sure, could manage it. Spear and shield is just the iconic weapon set throughout all of antiquity and just ancient history in general. Not even Europe by a long stretch. We talk about origins. We'll get on to origins. What's really the origin of a spear? It's a sharp stick. So we do see the spearhead evolve quite a bit. When you start to look at all these amazing samples we have of Viking Age spears, spearheads, they start to get extremely pointy, lending to a theory that they became more of an anti-armor weapon. We also see things like spears evolve in medieval history into things like the bill and the glaive. Really interesting polearms evolutions, but we really just mostly see the spear when it comes to our polearms. Later Viking Age, we get to things that are more battle specialized, like our next item, a Dane axe, or known as the Great Axe. I'm a pretty short guy. This one measures 4.5 feet. This measurement's an approximation based off of the height of the characters in the Bayeux Tapestry, where we had the Battle of Hastings. So we see these guys leaning on their Dane axes, lending to a theory that they could have been about this length. They could have even been smaller, but not one-handed, but longer halves. Matt Easton from Skull Gladiatoria has a really amazing, sharp, authentically made piece himself. And they're just incredible. This one is beefed up for reenactment. It's got an extra edge added to it, very rounded, and this is way thicker than the actual examples themselves. They are really, really thin cleaving blades. They are not as heavy and cumbersome as you might think. So moving along, next thing I want to talk about is the iconic Viking Age sword. Now there's a lot of great examples of swords in museums. I encourage anyone who's watching this video to really just take a peek. Just Google search Viking Sword museum. This isn't the most amazing example of a Viking replica sword, only because the grip's a little bit too large. It's something that gets overlooked quite a bit on replica swords, more of the price point swords. But when you get into like HEMA sparring swords, those tend to be oversized grips as well to accommodate the big hand protection you need. But Viking swords were very tight grip. It is said that a lot of the sword techniques involve the use of the pommel. So meaning that pommel was in your hand, so you didn't require a lot of grip. So if you look at this could have been that much shorter. They tended to not be the longest swords. A lot of single hand swords of the Middle Ages and medieval age were not very long. We start to get into longer weapons much later on. But they were about 33 inches to the maximum of 41 inches. Not very long. To compare it to an arming sword, which is a 39-inch arming sword, this is a 33-inch Viking Age sword. It's a pretty big distance between them. Now when it comes to the typology of these, which this is a type 15 oak shot, this is a type 10 oak shot. Now type 10 oak shots were not pointy, so this one's even less pointy for safety reasons. But some of the examples we have actually have a pretty round tip. You would be surprised. Not very functional thrusting weapons, even on cloth. Someone's wearing thick wool and you don't have a very acute tip, you probably won't get a great deal of penetration. So when we see things that were this one-handed European sword, they evolve into a much pointier sword in later ages to aid in the penetration of armor. So when we look at Viking swords, it helps us as reconstructive archaeologists make a few more assumptions about how much armor was worn by soldiers in the Viking Age. Now, if a sword was carried by everyone in the Viking Age, which it isn't, you would probably want it to be pretty pointy if everybody was wearing mail armor. That is one of the best ways to overcome mail armor, is to penetrate it. You need a very pointy tip. Viking swords were not very pointy. Vikings were known to be very smart tacticians and just overall badasses. If they were facing lots of mail, they would have anti-mail weapons other than axes. Now an axe is an especially great anti-mail weapon. It won't necessarily cut the man, but it will break the hell out of their bones. And that's why we see things like the mace become more and more needed when we see plate armor and we see lots and lots of mail armor. That Type X blade is just a hack chop blade, and it stuck around for a while. And we see things that are technically that Type X all the way back into migration era, a couple hundred years before the Viking Age. And some of the origins of this type of sword come from Roman influence, occupation, and such in the High Roman Age. Amazing cutting swords, and something once again you're using with a shield. So they evolve into things like the arming sword. And the arming sword, as you see, takes on this cruciform style look. Quite a few of them had like bowed guards, but this is a much later era sword. Things very similar in between the two would be a Brazil nut pommel Norman sword, and that became much pointier. The Normans were facing more mail armor. So this is not an anti-mail sword. They were beefy. Hit a guy really hard with this, yeah, it's gonna hurt, but you really are fighting against someone in cloth or bare skin to really be effective with this. Swords were something that were owned by the wealthy traders. They were owned by the sea kings and just well-known people. And yes, we do have a good few hundred, I believe, examples of Viking swords, but we have tons more spears, axes, and we have some relative idea of the populations that were traveling during that time. Spears not that hard to transport. It's not the worst thing. In close combat, spears can hold up really, really well. They're just a very superior weapon in so many ways. But a sword, absolutely. It's a fantastic weapon, and we've loved it all throughout time. It's been an effective item all throughout time, but it's also lended itself to evolution to defeat people wearing different types of armor. So we don't have things like lots of hand protection. That also really lends to using a shield. When you train sword and buckler, one of the main things you're taught is that buckler is your gauntlet. Not just for that hand out front, it's a gauntlet for both hands. So when you function and you're creating cuts and thrusts even, that shield is your gauntlet, lending to not needing hand protection. Very iconic weapon, but this isn't necessarily a Viking sword. It was a lot of very advanced techniques to create these blades. Very prolific cities were usually the places where good ones were made, and they were imported constantly. A lot of times not even hilted. So we do have evidence of like blades that we knew were akin to each other, hilted in very different ways, found in very different places, and you can imagine they told very different stories. But an arming sword, it's really kind of fun. Since I practice HEMA a bit, I'm a beginner. Arming sword is very pleasurable to practice because in a way it feels kind of like an ode to Viking Sword and Shield. It feels like that it's the great-great-great-great-grandchild of, Viking sword combat. It's just a bit of romanticism I like to carry around with me. So lastly, and almost most importantly, to go over some of the most basic things, so we're talking edged weapons. Knives. Basic knife. Not necessarily a weapon of war, but something that we would have carried. An edged weapon. This is considered a puukko. So it's a traditional Finnish blade. These date back as far as archaeology can find iron in the regions. Just a really small eating knife. Everyone was a craftsman in their own way. 110 uses for something like this. Even another similar thing to that. Another common Northern European blade. Things just like this were found all over Northern Europe during the Viking Age and onward. So this one's a little more crudely made, like an iron blade. But this could have served as a tool, implement for eating, or a weapon even. Once you get in this size, it's a little more of a fighting tool. And then this would have, I guess, really been known as a sax by all rights. No metal fittings, a sax. Not all saxes were broke back. So we have a broke back sax. So this is a laying sax. Some of the terminology for that is that you have your basic sax, your basic knife, your laying messer, and your laying sax, and your scram sax. We're going to talk about the messer in a second. So we do have kind of simple blades. This is not exactly an evolution of a sax. It's just a common, simple knife. Now, sax is a Germanic blade, so you're going to see it through the Frankish territories. You're going to see it all through England, even into the northern British Isles. Simple, long fighting knives. Even the dirk is theorized to maybe have been evolved from a sax later on. The sax is kind of a very influential tool. When you think about it, when you have a blade that's not exactly flat, it's a curved blade by a lot of rights. When we think about, or even look at, the arming sword, right? This was a very, very pointy blade at some point, but not insanely pointy. This one is kind of thin for sparring purposes, but this would have been tailored around armor penetration, like we were discussing. But they're not exactly even curved on the edge. We're talking about almost straight angles in some senses. On a Viking sword, in a way as well, that those edges were on straight planes and then became slightly acute and rounded. So not exactly curved. And where the point of percussion on these is flat. And on something like an arming sword, also flat. But a point of percussion on something like a sax, or this resembles a very basic knife, doesn't it? Very much not flat. So this, by all rights, yeah, is a sax. Then we have a lang sax, and a scram sax could be pretty darn long. But they do tend to have either a very flat edge, which still kind of leads to that same chop hack, but you get a really superb cut with a slight sweep like that. When you look at some of the better cutting swords that don't carry lots of mass, they tend to have slightly curved edges, or the way the sharpening is done is curved. So I did make a video about this sax in particular and made some of the correlations about the messer in the sax. So these are all kind of sharp, so I need to be a little bit cautious. So this isn't exactly the most historical version of a messer, and this is probably a lang messer. Gross messer can be pretty darn long, even long sword length. But you see, you got a pretty flat blade, but you also have that sweep. And this is not exactly a curved sword. It might make it seem that way because of that flare, but it's very much not a curved sword. It's a curved edge. And on this, we have a curved edge. And you can kind of see the way that these clip points are done. You can, I mean, geographically, these were carried by people in the exact same place, a few hundred years apart. That's really it. And this was a common man's weapon. Could have also been a king's weapon in a fancier way. It's the same story with the messer. This was a personal carry item of just an average person. But they do have very fancy ones. Kings did at some point adopt messers. What's ahistorical about this is the way the pommel is done on this. It's not sandwiched scale grips like a messer should be. Probably to be reinforced, it's a cutting messer. But the handguard and such, very cohesive. The distal taper, the weight, the rest of the typology is good, other than the blackened steel. Very beautiful cutting weapon. We could have had a scram sax about this size. You can envision that. Take away the hand protection, which I don't know why it took everybody so long to start adding hand protection, truly. Obviously, we weren't carrying shields as much in later history, but I mean, in a lot of ways, this is a sax. Just remove the gear. Store it upside down. Flatten that off. I really do buy that theory. To reiterate, your spear and your shield was always your main weapon set, and probably an axe and a sax of some sort. I feel that way through a good amount of research that most folks would have been carrying a fairly large knife, on campaign that is, axe, shield, spear. We'll catch you next time.